My $8,500 wedding cake was completely destroyed, but it was the best money I ever spent. Why? Because lying amidst that bright red mess was my own sister, about to fall into a deep sleep. She had intentionally drugged me right at my wedding to turn me into a drunken mess in front of my wealthy in-laws. I let her have her way, but at a much higher price. A gentle glass swap, a fake smile, and the result was the most satisfying sight of my life. My precious sister collapsing amidst the crumbs of red velvet. But to understand why my own sister wanted to ruin my big day, I have to take you back through the preparation process. I was Pamela, 29 years old, working as a marketing director at a prestigious firm in Charleston, and I had always prided myself on being self-possessed and logical. My younger sister Sutton, 27, was what she called an influencer, which was a fancy word for unemployed and living a virtual life on social media. What she didn't advertise to her 12,000 followers was the $51,000 in credit card debt she had been hiding from our parents. My parents, Conrad and Blythe, had always favored Sutton. Always. It defied all logic, all reason, all fairness. I could bring home straight A's, scholarships, job promotions, didn't matter. Sutton could post a selfie with a motivational quote stolen from Pinterest, and mother would frame it. Sutton's jealousy reached its absolute peak when I got engaged to Sterling. Sterling was an orthopedic surgery resident at the medical university, brilliant and kind, with hands that can reconstruct shattered bones, and a smile that makes my heart skip. But what really sent Sutton into a spiral wasn't his career, or his character, it was his last name. Sterling comes from old Charleston money, the kind of family whose ancestors signed important documents and had ships named after them, the kind of family that still gets invited to garden parties at historic estates, the kind of family Sutton desperately wanted access to. During the wedding preparations, she turned into an absolute nightmare. It started 3 months before the wedding. I was sitting in my apartment, reviewing vendor contracts, when Sutton showed up unannounced. She walked in wearing yoga pants that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget, and carrying a designer handbag I knew she couldn't afford. "I've been thinking," she announced, not bothering with hello. "I should be your maid of honor." I looked up from my spreadsheet. "Sutton, I already asked Adeline, your lawyer friend." She wrinkled her nose like she'd smelled something rotten. "Pamela, this is a wedding with old money elements. Do you really want someone who wears pantsuits to everything standing next to you in photos that will be in the society pages? Adeline is my best friend. She's been there for me through everything. And I'm your sister." Sutton's voice took on that whiny edge I knew too well. "Your only sister. What will people think if your own flesh and blood isn't your maid of honor? It'll look like we are estranged. It'll look bad for both of us. Besides, I need this, Pamela. Do you know how good this will be for my brand? A wedding at the historic Charleston Hotel. With Sterling's family. I could gain thousands of followers. I should have said no right then. Should have held my ground. But then she called mother. 2 hours later, both our parents showed up at my door. Mother was already dabbing at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. And father wore his disappointed expression, the one he'd perfected over decades of making me feel guilty for existing. "Pamela, sweetheart," mother said, taking my hands in hers. "Sutton is devastated. Absolutely devastated. She feels like you don't love her." "That's not. I never said that. I just wanted. Your sister is going through a difficult time right now." Father interrupted, his voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd use when the discussion was over before it began. "The least you can do is include her in your